Welcome, gentle reader, to this next episode of Everything is Everything. Amit, tell us what you have planned for us today.
So, Ajay, today what we are going to do is we are going to tackle a big subject with great humility. Now, I recently did an episode with the historian Manu Pillai on his excellent new book, Guns, Gods and Missionaries, right? And just before that, I did a 12-hour episode with the mythologist Devdutt Patnaik. And in the past, I've done episodes with Arshia Sattar on our epics, Ramayana and the Mahabharata. I've done an episode with Akshay Mukul on his great book on the Gita Press, which, illuminated aspects of our culture to me, which I didn't know, our society, rather. And I've done episodes with Tony Joseph and Peggy Mohan, which are also relevant to the subject for reasons I'll come to later in this episode. So I thought, why not do an episode on Hinduism? Now, to put it out there, I'm a non-believer, pretty much always have been for all my adult life. So I'm not a practicing Hindu and I'm not religious. Nevertheless, here we are as a society. Hinduism is a river that runs through this space and through all of us. And I thought that in in that quest of understanding what's going on, it makes sense to sort of do an episode like this, because I've had a bunch of thoughts around this, and the thoughts revolve around the complexity of the subject. You and I often talk about how there is a modern effort to turn complex phenomena into simple narratives, right? And there are two kinds of simple narratives about Hinduism that I object to and that I think miss the point. One of those simplistic narratives is that there was once a glorious Hindu past that got interrupted by foreign invaders, and we've got the invaders out kinda, but not completely, so we have to revive that glorious past, build a Hindu Rashtra, and regain the essence of Hinduism. This kind of narrative is muscular. It is also political. It can be used for nationalistic purposes. It is a rousing narrative. I don't entirely agree with it. The other kind of narrative which comes out of academia, which I was pretty much subscribed to until recently when I began to see nuances, is that actually Hinduism is not one thing. It's a relatively new construction. The word Hinduism itself was coined by a Britisher in the late 18th century, and the British come to India. They're trying to make sense of this complex country. Their immediate interlocutors are this Brahman upper class who sell them on a particular vision of Hinduism, which is an early Vedic sort of impression, and then that propagates its way through. They form their version of Hinduism through those narratives, and then they feed it back to us, and then we believe it, and then our self-image is determined by what is in the mirror that they are showing us, and we begin to lose some of the complexity. And the extreme argument often here is that Hinduism didn't really exist before that, and this is also not true. As Manu puts it in his excellent book, that the name may be new, but the river was always there, and it is that river that I'd like to talk about, because it's actually a beautiful and rousing story which touches upon many of the themes that you and I often discuss.
Where should we start, Amit, on this story?
We should start with a poem. So I'm going to read out one of my favorite poems by the poet Dilip Chitre. It's called Father Returning Home. My father travels on the late evening train. Standing among silent commuters in the yellow lights, suburbs slide past his unseeing eyes. His shirt and pants are soggy, and his black raincoat, stained with mud, and his bag stuffed with books, is falling apart. His eyes, dimmed by age, fade homeward through the humid monsoon night. Now I can see him getting off the train like a word dropped from a long sentence. He hurries across the length of the grey platform, crosses the railway line, enters the lane. His chappals are sticky with mud, but he hurries onward. Home again, I see him drinking weak tea, eating a stale chapati, reading a book. He goes into the toilet to contemplate man's estrangement from a man-made world. Coming out, he trembles at the sink, the cold water running over his brown hands. A few droplets cling to the graying hairs on his wrists. His sullen children have often refused to share jokes and secrets with him. He will now go to sleep, listening to the static on the radio, dreaming of his ancestors and grandchildren, thinking of nomads entering a subcontinent through a narrow pass. And I want that image of nomads entering a subcontinent through a narrow pass, of that long line which kind of connects us, all of us, is where I kind of want to begin. Because even before Hinduism, there is a question of what was in this subcontinent, what is the history of humanity, how did we get here, right? And to get a sense of this, I recommend reading this great book by David Reich called Who We Are and How We Got Here, which looks at modern genetic evidence to kind of tell that story. Tony Joseph has a great book called Early Indians, which also draws upon that. Now, here is a broad narrative of what is happening. The first sort of fossil in the fossil record, the first evidence of Homo sapiens existing is found 300,000 years ago in Africa, right? Now, around 210,000 years ago, you get the first evidence of Homo sapiens, modern humans, existing outside Africa. It is somewhere in Greece. But it is 70,000 years ago that actually humans fanned out from across Africa successfully. We say successfully because none of the earlier sort of migrants, as it were, have left any trace in the genetic record. So they didn't succeed. They went to places, they kind of died out, it didn't work out, and there are other hominids that they're kind of struggling with. But about 70,000 years ago, the first bunch of migrants leave Africa, and everything else emerges from that bunch of migrants. Now, about 65,000 years ago to 60,000 years ago, sometime in that range, some of them actually land up in the subcontinent. And they are the early humans who are here for a long, long time. We know very little about
Tony
them.
Joseph's book describes the path taken. It's from the Gulf at about Basra, and you're riding all along the coast. The coastal peoples who make it past what is modern Pakistan into modern Kutch. And so sort of they came along the sea into India, into what is now India.
Sure. I mean, I don't remember the exact path, but they land up in India, and there are other hominids there, non-Homo sapiens, as it were, who are there. So they take different paths and they kind of avoid them. They don't get into conflict. But eventually, the early humans settle there, and thousands of years go by. Then, approximately 7,000 years ago, you find traces of a settlement in Mehergarh, which is now in Pakistan, which we now know through genetic evidence, and I'll come back to what I mean by that, which we now know is a settlement of migrants from Iran. So these pastoralists from Iran come down and they settle in Mehergarh, and from there they fan out a little bit, and from there they are sort of intermingling, as it were, with the early Indians who are already there southwards. And then over the next few centuries, what you have is traces of Harappan civilization, or what we can also call the Indus Valley civilization, and that kind of comes about. And it's really interesting because you have early agriculture happening here, to agriculture kind of maturing. And if you look at the Indus Valley civilization, it's quite sophisticated in some ways. The urban planning is outstanding. We don't, of course, understand their script yet. But one interesting aspect is something that you and I would agree with. And this is a really interesting frame I got from Devdutt Patnaik's new book on Harappa, which is the concept of ahimsa. To him, the concept of ahimsa is actually voluntary transaction between consenting adults, right? Exactly the way we would describe free trade, where he has a memorable line about how it is clear from the way the city was designed that they prioritize traders over raiders. Right? So it puts ahimsa in a new light. Ahimsa is not just non-violence, but what is the ultimate sort of expression of it is actually peaceful trade. And I kind of love that, to think that free enterprise is in that sense almost literally, but not literally, in our DNA. So anyway, so that is sort of the Harappan civilization that's growing over a period of time, right? And then approximately 2100 years ago, there is another wave of migrants which are coming from the steppes. And these are, of course, the Indo-Europeans, as we would now call them, or the Aryans, as they could be called. Now, I want to clarify here that there is a bit of a controversy that goes on over here, which is partly ideological and has a bit to do with politics, that what I read in my school books is there was an Aryan invasion, right? And this became controversial because of various reasons, two main reasons. Number one, the Nazis really loved this story, that they're fanning out across the world and they're conquering everything. So they got the term Aryan from accounts of this Aryan invasion, as it were. And they also borrowed the swastika from Hindu mythology and, turned it into Hitler's symbol. And that is one reason it's deeply unpopular to talk of the Aryan migration. And within people in India, there is also the sense that, hey, outsiders didn't come and invade us. We are the original people. There was no migration. There was nothing. We are who we are, and that is what the narrative was. Now, how do you settle this? You can't really go back into the past and settle this, because archaeology will have scant evidence and then everything becomes about interpretation. But in recent years, they did become a way to settle this. And where the science advanced was in terms of genetics. There's a gentleman named Luca Cavalli Sforza who came out with a book a few decades ago called The History and Geography of Human Genes. And he figured out that you can use genetic evidence and you can actually go back into deep history and tell with a surprising amount of certainty when people, arrived at a particular spot, who were they intermingling with, what exactly was going on and so forth. And in the last 10 years, in fact, the science is relatively recent. In the last 10 years, we've had startling discoveries about our history. I would recommend to you, gentle readers, that read David Reich's book, Who We Are and How We Got Here, and also Tony's book for an excellent sort of illustration of this. And for example, genetic history can then tell you that if the genetic strain of the Indo-Aryans, as it were, only appears around 2100 years ago, you know that that's when they came. You can actually kind of date it. I shouldn't say 2100 years ago, 2100 BC. So 2100 BCE, the Indo-Aryans kind of land up. Now, what is happening here is a grand party for a long time. For about 2000 years after they come, till about minus 50 BCE or so, everybody's intermingling with everybody else, right? Now, we don't know whether they invaded or not, but there certainly was an Aryan migration. They came from outside, mostly men came, and that much we can tell from certainty from the genes. And gentle readers, read those particular books to understand the science behind it. I won't go into it in detail, but it's all there. So they come and there's a peaceful intermingling happening where everybody is kind of partying with everyone else, and all of that is great. But that whole story of the Aryan invasion, we simply don't know, because there is no archaeological record of any invasions per se. The sites that exist haven't been destroyed. There are no signs of war. But equally, a point that Reich makes is that when you look at the invasion of Rome by Germanic forces, if you just looked at the archaeology, you would not find evidence of that either. So what does that even mean? But the bottom line is that these guys came. It was mostly men who came, and then they intermingled with the local population, and then they sort of settled in there. Now, what's happening when they come here? What's happening is that in this intermingling, they are themselves changing in deep ways. So if you look at the Vedas, for example, the Vedas is not one series like the Harry Potter series ki 10 saal mein likh diya. It takes place over decades and takes ages to actually formulate. The early Vedas, like the Rig Vedas, are very similar to other Indo-European mythologies, from Europe and from Central Asia, right? But the later Vedas start changing in dramatic ways. In the Rig Veda, it's interesting that you find mentions of horses and chariots. Now, before their coming, there is no mention of horses and chariots anywhere. They don't show up on the inscriptions at Harappa and so on and so forth, so they're not there. But gradually they come, and the mythology starts changing to the extent that the early Vedas and the later Vedas are startlingly different, and the Puranas, of course, are a whole new story, literally, and I'll elaborate upon all of these as we go along this episode. And the language also changes. Now it is true that Sanskrit, as it comes in, and by the way, Tony Joseph makes a pretty good supposition that whatever the Indus Valley language was, it eventually evolved into the Dravidian language, and perhaps even Tamil. Tamil, in a sense, is older than Sanskrit. It really depends on how you date it, but it is a language of great antiquity. I was taught in school that all the Indian languages have come from Sanskrit, which is absolutely not true. The Dravidian languages haven't, and Tamil is probably older. Now, an interesting thing happens when you look at Sanskrit, that Sanskrit, while it is definitely descended from the other Indo-Aryan languages, has certain elements of it which you don't find anywhere else, right? And to illustrate this, I will ask you to say the word dant.
Dant.
Correct. Now I will ask you to say the word dant.
Dant.
Correct. Right? And what is happening is, when you say dant, your tongue is hitting the upper part of the teeth. Right? These are dental sounds, and these are common across all the Indo-Aryan languages. When you're saying dant, in both the d and the t, your tongue is hitting, the part of the mouth above that. It's curling inwards. These are called retroflex sounds. Retroflex sounds are not there in any of the Indo-Aryan languages. So this is Sanskrit coming here, and it is adapting from the languages that are already here, because it is there in all the Dravidian languages, along with a vast cornucopia of other sounds. Now, this is an insight I picked up from Peggy Mohan's great book, Wanderers, Kings and Merchants, and she cites Madhav Deshpande's great essay on this subject about how, the Rig Veda was influenced by what was here before that. And it's an essay that came out in 1976, and it pretty much blew everyone away, because you're like, wow, because until then, the vision was that, Sanskrit is a pure language. One bunch of people is saying it originated here, but another bunch of people is saying that no, it came with the Indo-Aryans. But then you realize that what is really happening here is that it itself is a khichdi. It is not one thing. Language evolves through spontaneous order. People are traveling, they're talking to other people, etc., etc. This is evolving. Peggy in her book has this fascinating narration of how it is mostly male migrants who are coming, right? And they are marrying local women, and they are marrying local women, and the local women speak a different language, they speak different language. The kids grow up with their mothers for the first 2-3 years, and then they go out hunting or whatever men in those times do with the men. And thus, you have separate languages being spoken almost metaphorically for what has happened through human existence, but you also then have this intermingling of languages. And it's a great illustration of how there is this sort of khichdi forming, and that gets us through to the Puranic period, right? So those guys have come here. The Aryan migration has taken place, and initially they have the Vedas, and you see, a mirroring of many of the Indo-Aryan myths, which are, common in various places, gods of nature, Indra and Agni, so on and so forth. Wind, fire, all of that is happening. And then that gradually begins to mutate, and the later Vedas have Shiva and Vishnu, and a multiplicity is beginning to form. And that multiplicity then explodes as they go southwards. Now, before I go on to the Puranic period, as it were, to bring us through to modern times, or 1700, 1800 years, before the British come, before colonialism happens, I also want to talk for a moment about the role of religion. Like, why does religion even exist? Right? And I think of three possible reasons for it. Reason number one is consolation. We're all going to die. Life is nasty, brutish, and short. What do you do? You got to tell yourself a story that makes you go on. In fact, those who are successful in telling themselves a story like that will possibly do better as far as passing on their genes is concerned. So we are literally wired for believing in religion and believing in stories like this. So reason number one is consolation. Reason number two is explanation. You are on a bewildering world. Forget no internet. There are no clothes. You don't have anything. There is no knowledge. How do you make sense of the world? There is a sun, there is a wind, random things are happening. You catch a cold and you die. You make sense of it again by inventing a mythology with gods and so on and so forth, which is why the earliest gods are nature gods, the sun god, etc., etc. And therefore, explanation, and this, you can also call this the god of the gaps, right? You need religion to fill in all the gaps in our knowledge. And what has happened through human history is that more and more and more, all the gaps have been taken up by science and so on. And there is less and less a need for the explanatory power of religion, but nevertheless, it survives. And the third reason is for a codification of the mores of a society, right? And it is not that a society is framed in its behavior by the religion that it believes in. It is also the case that the ways in which people naturally learn to interact with each other then get codified within the religion itself and become part of the religion. So to me, these are the three reasons why religion is so powerful, and I thought I'll just share this frame before we move on to the next section.
There is a evolutionary biology argument running at the same time about uh, the idea that our genes are predisposed for religion, and that runs around the idea that we are at 150-person hunter-gatherer bands, and the bands that achieved greater social coherence were able to achieve military conquest over others. So when the mutations took place for creating religiosity, for being willing to believe that there is a guy in the sky and we all believe in him, and we are here to root out all the non-believers. That gene is actually very functional because it produces coherence amongst those 150 people. And so again and again through history, there were evolutionary successes delivered to the people who were willing to sign on to that kind of framework. Yes, Amit, go on with the story.
Yeah, so I want to go on with the story, but I once again want to plug Manu's excellent book and his episode with me. This book has an introductory essay called A Brief History of Hinduism. That's the introduction, that's before the book begins. And it really covers the Puranic period, as it were, the period I'm going to talk about now. So it is really my primary source for what I'm going to talk about, because I knew a lot of this before, but he has synthesized it so beautifully that I recommend everyone just go out and buy the book. Now, here is where that period begins. That period begins with the Indo-Aryans, as it were, who have just come in, who assimilated, who spent a bit of time here, now beginning to fan out through the subcontinent. Now, here's the thing. We imagine the subcontinent today and we are like, the distances are really compressed for us. One, we know what the subcontinent is because we have lines on a map. And two, it doesn't seem a big deal. We catch a flight, 2 घंटे Delhi से Chennai पहुंच गए, or we take a train and etc. etc. But in those days, you don't have the lines on the map. You don't have a shape of what the country is. Progress is very gradual. It can take generations to go from one place to another, etc. etc. So that is sort of the landscape in which this expansion is taking place. And what is happening is that as these people fan out, right, they have this sort of Vedic religion still with them. The upper rung of their sort of people, as it were, are the Brahmins. They have the Vedic religion, but they don't have political power necessarily. They do alliances with political power at different points in time, but they don't have political power. So as they are fanning out, they can't conquer these people and make them believe what they think is right? And you'll see this go in a different direction when colonialism happens. But right now, at this point in time, they can't impose their value system and their beliefs on the local people. So what do? They adapt. They start to assimilate, right? And they, whenever they go to a local place, there'll be a belief system there. And these belief systems are related, but it is not one belief system. There is nothing which is like a unified religion that the country believes in. People believe in all kinds of different local things, and I am guessing that there is some geographical congruence that your beliefs are likely to be similar to your neighbor but different, and the differences grows with space. So everywhere,
I think of it exactly like language.
yeah.
That every 100 kilometers, the language evolves incrementally. So, it's very reasonable to think of some instinctive animistic beliefs which keep on evolving with the kilometers.
Which keep on evolving with the kilometers. So they're going into all of these different places, and there are all of these different local beliefs. So what they do quite beautifully is they start incorporating these beliefs, right? And as they start incorporating these beliefs, they tell stories about them, and these are the Puranas. Manu in his book says, the Puranas are works of genius. They acquired their fluid form not to meet present-day scholarly standards, but to tie the local with the pan-Indian and the evolving with the stable, to universalize what was provincial while seeing the parochial with the universal. And Manu gives some great examples of how this happens. He talks about how, for example, there's a Chenchu tribe in Andhra Pradesh, right? And rather than go to that Chenchu tribe and say, hey, you are savages, we are civilized, we will teach you religion, they just incorporate their religious practices into those, and they invent this sort of mythological story, where Vishnu consorts with a Chenchu woman and the kid is a Chenchu god. And that's the whole deal that is there. Ayanar, who is a god in Tamil country, is then mythologized and build a mythology around him, where he is actually Shiva's son after Shiva consorts with a beguiling female version of Vishnu, as a book puts it. Similarly, in 12th century Maharashtra, you have Vithal incorporated as a deity of Vishnu. Some locals protest and they say, no, he's Jan tradition and all of that. But they are like, no, dude, avatar of Vishnu. And in fact, there's a common sort of thread running through that the way people who believe in Shiva will incorporate local customs is they'll just expand Shiva's family and they'll build stories around it. While for Vishnu, if you're up against a major local god, just make the dude an avatar and you're completely fine there.
When we compare against the stories of some other religions, we see this idea that if there's a single book and if there is enough error correcting systems, that it's not an oral tradition, it's a written book, then that can become a boundary, it can become a well defined constraint, and then organic evolution of the religion cannot happen. So is there a story here that there was no printing press and the texts are vast and it's a oral tradition, so it becomes far more malleable, and at each place people can keep coming up with a modified version?
I think that's actually an incredible and important point, because what happens when you write something down is that it becomes ossified. As we'll see later in the story, when the British come here, they'll do a census and they'll make everybody write which caste they are and so on. And there is an argument that that leads to a certain kind of ossification. And before that, everything is open. So, the scholar M.G. Ranade, described this period, and he spoke about how during this period, Hinduism was conquered by the multitudes, right? So it contains multitudes, but it's also conquered by the multitudes, and the multitudes become Hinduism. So there's this beautiful process playing out over there. And Dilip Menon describes this process by saying, quote, deceased ancestors, local heroes and heroines, gods of the Vedic pantheon and nature gods all rubbed shoulders in a seamless fabric of worship. And what's happening here is that there's also an interplay between power and religion, right? If somebody gains power in a particular area, they find it convenient to allow Brahmins to, set the narrative for them, because it establishes a clear hierarchy, and, they can make themselves part of the story and justify why they are the kings, and how it is divinely ordained, or how at least it is a natural order of things, and so on and so forth. So through all of this, the Indo-Aryans, the Brahmins, are kind of navigating their way into positions of influence that game is playing, but they're never really pushing too hard so that the fabric breaks. They're incorporating, they're assimilating, all of those things are happening. And Manu Devadevan is another historian who has this interesting book called The Prehistory of Hinduism. And, Manu Pillai quotes Manu Devadevan in his book, and, makes a fascinating point. And he says, worshipping a deity was simply a part of everyday life, not a marker of identity. Just as wearing cotton clothes, residing in a thatched hut, or making love never produced identities like cotton wearer, thatched hut dweller, or love maker, so also the worshipping of Shiva or Vishnu did not confer identities. And so these are not fundamental identities. People aren't putting labels on themselves. But what is also happening is that you are having a lot of feuds between different groups of people based on which tribe they are part of, quote unquote tribe, or which god they worship. So a lot of the bitterest battles are between worshippers of Shiva and worshippers of Vishnu, Shaivites and Vaishnavites, who call each other names, who fight, and they fight with the Jains and the Buddhists. They destroy each other's places of worship. It's actually like Game of Thrones, that people are just going mad, and there are people who are, ranting about Brahmins as well. The Basava Purana talks about, begins with a dog reciting the Vedas, as a clear sign of disrespect. And then they talk about how when an untouchable sees a Brahmin, they immediately go and take a bath to purify themselves. So it's get a lot of satire and different ways of raising your voice happening here. And even as far as Brahmins are concerned, they are also adapting. You go to a particular place and the powerful guys there, don't know who the hell you are, and you can just turn them into Brahmins and you can build a story around it. So you have Brahmins who are veg, you have Brahmins who are non-veg, you have Brahmins who follow cremation, you have Brahmins who bury their dead, right? You have Brahmins who oversee human sacrifice. So all of this shit is happening. It's a vast evolving tapestry that is unfolding. And at this moment, there seems to be no outer border to it. Anyone who, comes into it is welcome. I almost think of religion in this period as a curation driven by spontaneous order. This is a religion forming itself from the
Bottom up.
bottom up, right? It is not top down, which is important. The two simplistic narratives we spoke about at the start of this episode, they are top down narratives. The people at the top trying to make sense of a complicated world and imposing a simple narrative on it. But actually, Hinduism formed from the bottom up through the lives and rituals of people, and that is how things are playing out right now.
Okay, and then we get to the invasions. tell us how this world responded to the Islamic invasions.
So, first of all, uh, Islam, when it first comes into India, does not invade. It comes with ahimsa, it comes to trade. And you have this happening in Kerala, off the coast. The early sort of Muslims who land up are traders. Some say this happened in the lifetime of Muhammad itself. They are traders, they are peaceful, things are happening to mutual benefit, which is also why the communal feeling in the south may sometimes seem less than in the north. So, so they are not part of that invader narrative. The invader narrative is happening from the north, where the narrative is that the raiders come, and the raiders do come, and the raiders at times are barbaric. But there is an interesting process playing out here. And I'll go back to economics for this, and I'll go back to Mancur Olson, right? Mancur Olson gave me the framework of roving bandit and stationary bandit. And essentially, what the frame means is that assume you are a bunch of people living somewhere and bandits come. Roving bandits are bandits who come, they take whatever they can and they go. So their incentive is not to leave anything standing. They'll destroy everything and then they'll get, go away from there. A stationary bandit is a bandit who comes and then he wants to stay there so he can keep looting you. And his incentives are different. He doesn't want to destroy everything. He doesn't want to kill the goose that will lay the golden eggs. He wants there to be a steady stream of revenue and sustenance over a period of time, and therefore he will try to govern the people. He will try to fit in. He will not try to piss them off. And over a period of time, he will become of the people, which you see later with the Mughals marrying so many Rajput princesses. This is the distinction that we need to make. So what's happening here is that when they come, they do destroy temples, just as Vaishnavites and Shaivites and Jains and Buddhists were fighting. There is some of that. Invader has come. Religion doesn't matter. They'll just hit you where it hurts. But after a while, what happens is once they settle down, once the Mughal dynasty sort of starts expanding, the violence is only at the edges. Richard Eaton has written wonderfully well about this, that once the empire is in space and they're ruling over a particular place, then they are coexisting, then they are chilling. They may not accept that Brahmins are top of the hierarchy, but they are treating you well and you're in the court and there's a lot of intermarriage happening and etc. etc. All that is happening. But when they are expanding through violence and through coercion, then there might be destruction on the edges, but there certainly is destruction on the edges. And this does an interesting thing. This makes everybody else who is non-Islamic now think of themselves in a unified kind of way, in a political sense. That earlier they are at loggerheads. I believe in Shiva, you believe in Vishnu, Namsita and Vaishnava are Jains or Buddhist or whatever, we are all fighting with each other. But then a common enemy comes who says, stop this show, you're all going to jail, right? And instantly we unite against that common enemy. So there is a sense of that happening. It should not be overstated, because there's also a mutual romance happening. And, Manu writes in his book about how in Sindh, Ali is adopted as an avatar of Vishnu. How in Maharashtra there is a god who is then also worshipped by some Muslims. So there's all of this syncretic stuff also happening. But for the first time, there is a sense that there is something that unites us. It doesn't yet have the word Hindu attached to it. That word comes later. But there is a sense that it is there, but it is also dangerous to overstate it, because so many things are happening and these buggers are still fighting each other. And if you look at, many of the classic battles between, say, Mughal emperor and Hindu rebel who's fighting him, you'll find that half the generals of the Mughal emperor were Hindu. And you equally had, Muslim mercenaries on the other side, like Turkish mercenaries who fought for Shivaji, if I remember correctly. Manu has a great book on, the Deccan as well, which elaborates on some of this. So there's a lot that is syncretic in terms of cultural influences, in terms of the food that is being eaten. We have an episode on how all the food that you think is Indian actually came from somewhere else. The clothes that we wear, So what is Indian, who is to kind of define it? But for the first time, as Manu says, that there is a sense that there is an other and we can unite against the other. And this feeling becomes much more sharper when colonialism begins.
On the subject of the cruelty, I think that many times we do wrong when we single out some tales of cruelty, because the medieval world was horrible for everybody, meaning there are no good guys in the medieval world. Gruesome levels of barbarism and cruelty were prevalent everywhere in the world. And so we should be cautious to not judge some people of that period by today's standards.
And before we get to colonialism, I want to stay on this period for a moment, and I want to talk about our epics, right? If you look at other religions, other mythologies, there are books. Those books are definitive things. Everything kind of comes from there. Either they are holy or not holy. That depends. That varies. And people adopt that Western frame to look at India, and they look at, for example, our holy books, and they think the Vedas are one thing. As I pointed out, it was written over centuries, so it's many different things in schools of thoughts. And also the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are not one book. They are almost like rivers. A.K. Ramanujan has this great essay called 300 Ramayanas, where he shows how through history the Ramayana is constantly being rewritten at different times and different places according to local customs. People are adding bits to it, people are taking away bits from it. I call them open source epics, right? Everybody is kind of contributing, and 300 is what the number that Ramanujan chose, but there are many more, and perhaps growing by the day even in modern times. And they all tell different aspects of the story. For example, Surpanakha in the original Valmiki tale is supposed to be ugly, but then Kanban later describes her as beautiful. In the Telugu version of the Ramayana, Urmila, Lakshman's wife, she doesn't go to the forest with him, of course, in any version, but in the Telugu version, she sleeps for 14 years. You know, half the time she's sleeping for herself, half the time she's sleeping for Lakshman, so he can stay awake. You know, in the Bengali version by Kritivasa, which is around the 15th century, the concept of the Lakshman Rekha comes up. The concept of the Lakshman Rekha, that do not cross this line, and it becomes a normative thing that is used, you know, as a powerful metaphor for the lines that people should not transgress in today's time, is not in the original Valmiki. That concept comes up in the Bengali version by Kritivasa. See, Bengali is being normative again. We know best, we'll tell you what to do. It is also in Kritivasa that an element is added to the story of Ram and Sita. After they're reunited, there is gossip about Sita, right? And in the earlier versions, that gossip is just general gossip on the streets. Kritivasa dramatizes it, and there's a particular washerman, and the washerman begins the gossip, and it explodes from there, right? Who built the bridge to Lanka? Different versions have different stories happening. In some versions, you know, Love and Kush are not two people but one people, and there's a story about how Kush comes about. So there's a beautiful tapestry of stories where people are feeding in their own local beliefs, perhaps, or they're just using their imagination as storytellers, and they're doing all of this. So, and I find that utterly wonderful. You know, I am not at all disturbed by the fact that there isn't one book. Did this happen? You know, is this a version I should believe in or whatever? I think it's a beautiful thing that, you know, a book being like a river, you never, you know, step into the same river twice, so you never step into the same Ramayana twice, and that's amazing.
Okay, in all this, now where do we fit colonial India into the picture?
At the end of Manu's book, he has a startling image. And the image is that imagine that there are four brown skinned men sitting in a room, and they are talking, they're squabbling, they're arguing. Suddenly, a white skinned man comes in, and the white skinned man starts attacking them. And then they are all similarly victimized by the white skinned man. And until this moment, these brown skinned men may not have realized we have brown skin. They may have felt no sense of unity. They're different people. Suddenly, white guy comes in, and they feel this sense of unity, and that sense of unity becomes a unified identity, right? Now, the journey of Islam into India is complicated. They came partly as traders. When they came as invaders, yes, it did some damage, but once they settled down, it's a completely different and more.
So it's a much longer period.
It's a much longer period. So that sense that we versus the other hasn't solidified to that extent. As the British begin coming in, it does. As the colonialists start coming in, sorry, it does, and it does partly because of missionary zeal and also because of this phenomenon called cognitive closure. Have you heard of cognitive closure? So cognitive closure is a term in psychology. It means that something is deeply complicated, you can't grok it, but you need closure, right? The complexity is too hard for you to deal with. So therefore you make up a story about it, which is possibly false, right? So now the Portuguese come here, and they are the first of the people that Manu talks about in his book. And there is, for a few centuries, there is this sort of tension between the merchants and the missionaries. So right now when the Portuguese come, they've come as merchants. Right, the Jesuits who come with them, who want to do missionary work, are kind of on the back burner, but at the same time, they are looking at the local people. They can't possibly grok this open source religion and all the madness that is going on, and they want to convert them to their way because they believe that their way is the correct way. And at this point, mind you, the missionaries are professional missionaries. They are people of the church, like the Jesuits are. And I want you at this point to sort of look at the incentives in play. The missionaries are not always in the pay of the merchants. They need to raise funds locally, back in Portugal or back in, as the other countries come into the fray wherever they are from. So their incentives are towards fundraising, right? What a modern NGO will always do when it has to fundraise, it will play to the incentives. This can even mean that you tell the most extreme version of the story possible, so you get funds. If things are kind of good, you're not going to say things are kind of good because you're not going to get money. So what the missionaries started doing here is that they started sending the craziest stories back about what is happening in India. It was almost like, tabloid spin in a sense. You have one Italian missionary who makes up this story about how there is a god which is half man, half ox, who literally speaks from his mouth and demands the blood of 400 virgins regularly. So the story there is that just as Christian parents will give a child to the church, that Indian parents have to, agree to have a child beheaded so that this god can be fed. Completely made up, absolutely not true. It's really like a lot of early speculative fiction is happening at this point. And over the years, both with the Portuguese and with the British who come later, you have stories of this kind circulating. Many of them are deeply erotic in nature, right? And I'll come to Victorian morality later, but Europe at this point must have been deeply sexually repressed because the kind of stories that started going back. Like one of the stories these people made up is that Akbar has a grandson, the grandson has a shrine, and that shrine, on the one hand, pilgrims come to it, but on the other hand, there are all these lonely widows, these ladies who are sexually starved. So they hang out there, and when the male pilgrims come, they take their pick of the male pilgrims to satisfy themselves, right? There is another story about how there are these powerful women, and they have these syndicates of kidnappers who will go out on the street and they will kidnap men and they will bring those men to them so they can enjoy those men for a night, right? Which is clearly something that doesn't happen anywhere. It is a mad fantasy of some, bored, frustrated missionary somewhere. And one of those stories, tells a tale of a woman who actually has a man kidnapped from the street only to find out it is her own lawfully wedded husband. So all kinds of nonsense is happening. There are stories being told of child sacrifice. They come across sati, they're trying to explain sati. Now, sati, of course, is a great social evil. But how do you explain it? And their framework for explaining it is that men know that women like to be unfaithful to them because Indian women are apparently quote unquote lecherous and unfaithful. And therefore, men are scared that the women will kill them and consort with other lovers. So, to prevent their being killed, they say that if we die, the woman will be burned with us. So, it is incentives at play, but with completely the wrong assumptions, right? So, and this story actually has something to do with what was happening in medieval Britain, because in medieval Europe, apparently, when a woman was caught, being unfaithful to her husband, there are places where they were actually burnt at the stake. So they're almost transposing their own evils onto us and assuming, that must, be the reason. And they're sending crazy numbers. Like there's one particular year where somebody reports that there were 10,000 satis this year. Well, actually, as Manu finds out, there were 38. Now, 38 is still 38 too many, but, the numbers are out of whack. And this affects everyone in Europe because what they're getting is this smut. Like imagine, Ajay Shah, if your view of the world was based on what the tabloids tell you, right? And the worst of the tabloids, Indian tabloids are not even that bad, right? It would be a mess. So Voltaire, for example, reads all the stories and he is like, oh, what a barbarous nation, and he goes crazy. John Stuart Mill's father, James Mill, writes a book in the 19th century, early 19th century, called a History of India, something to that effect. I forget the exact title. And he has never been to India. He has never visited India. So his entire history is based on all these second-hand sources, which is people, exaggerating. And it's a race to exaggerate who can exaggerate more. And that's a whole game that is being played out over there. So this is one strand of thinking. Another strand of thinking that is also happening simultaneously throughout the period I describe is that there is some respectful interaction. Manu tells a story of this Dutch gentleman named Bartholomew Ziegenbalg. Ziegenbalg comes here, and the initial thing is that, hey, you got to be a missionary, you got to convert these guys or whatever, and that is always the impulse. But then he engages, and he engages more and more, and he finds that just as Hinduism has been consumed by multitudes, Hinduism contains multitudes. He finds in the later Vedas a lot of wisdom. And he sends his report back to his overlords saying that, listen, guys, you got it all wrong, right? There is nothing we have to teach them. The best of our learnings are mirrored somewhere or the other in their teachings. You know, it's all there to be found. It's awesome. And then they just kind of slap him down and say, like, fuck off, what are you doing? You know, your Stockholm syndrome, though, of course, the term didn't exist then. So you have a lot of respectful interaction. Manu gives great details of dialogues and debates which are happening during that period, and all of it is awesome, but it is very much the minority. You know, much as today you have, it seems that intelligent discourse is such a narrow part of the overall discourse. The overall discourse is shrill, it's people shouting at each other, not talking to each other, attacking other people, ad hominem, gali galot, simple narratives. It's kind of like that. And somewhere that age also has an Amit Varma and Ajay Shah, and they're chatting with the British interlocutors and everything is civil. But that's a small part of it.
Okay, Amit, let's carry that story further. At first, when the Portuguese traders respectfully showed up at Calicut, their priority was trade. They wanted to buy pepper. At what point did the missionary phenomenon become more and more important politically?
So the missionaries were never dominant over the merchants until something that both of us like a lot, the Industrial Revolution, right? We are fans of the Industrial Revolution for various reasons. Prosperity across the world just went up because of it, etc., etc. But one of the side effects was that it created a category of people called the freelance missionary. Earlier, remember, if you were a missionary, like the early Jesuit priests, you were part of the church, you were part of a formal order. Now, absolutely anybody could come and become a missionary, right? So you had freelance missionaries. Manu in his books talks about a guy who was a shoemaker, right? And he's coming here. And so you have a competition in terms of missionary attention. And all of these guys are sending crazy accounts back to England. And their journals, like Manu talks about the journals where all these accounts are published, are selling literally in the hundreds of thousands in the late 18th, early 19th century. So what happens is this turns a tide, that at the end of the 18th century, it is still the merchants on top, and the British are telling the missionaries that, hey, just control, pehle paisa. But then within 20 years it changes completely, and that missionary zeal becomes a part of different parts of the order. It depends who's the governor general, what's happening out there. And this leads to a certain, an increase in religious oppression and an increase in the response to it, right? For example, the laws. Once the British start governing different regions, what are the laws that will be in play? There are the bottom-up laws that have been there forever, some of which may seem barbaric and savage to the British, and it is reasonable to say that no, let us, impose our own structure on these people, or at least it seems reasonable to them. But what they end up doing, in the words of Purushottam Agarwal, is instead of cutting the cloth to fit the body, they cut the body to fit the cloth. That they simply don't care what local customs and mores are, and they're like, these are our laws, you have to follow it, you just have to kind of go by it. And a lot of the laws have this kind of Victorian morality to it. We think of behaving in certain ways as sanskari. Actually, the prudish behavior is not Indian at all. It is something that the Victorians brought in. You see this even in the way they treat our epics. For example, Shakuntala in the original, when she's in action, is sweaty and she's sultry and there's stuff happening and it's awesome stuff, right? When William Jones translates it, he almost just takes away all the sensuality of what is going on over there. They simply can't take it. They are going nuts. So earlier I spoke about the erotic fantasies of some of these guys who are sending these stories back, but equally now the full Victorian morality has come in. They're imposing that on the people. You know, Manu in his first book, The Ivory Throne, which is about Kerala, wrote about how at one point in time it was common for women in Kerala to be bare-breasted. That is just the way it was. There was no sexualization there. That was the whole place. But then the British come in and they can't like deal with this shit, and everything kind of changes there. So that is one element that earlier it's like fine, they're ruling you, they're taking the taxes, but they're broadly saying that apart from that you live how you want, is none of our business. That begins to change where they start interfering in that and they start messing with that. What also begins to change in a subtler way is, you know, what story are you telling yourself about yourself? There's this great line by Shudipto Kaviraj, which Manu quotes in his book. To give itself a history is the most fundamental act of self-identification of a community. And what the British have done here is they've taken a very simplistic view of what Indian history is and what Indian religion is. And this is that Brahmanical view, which is very caste-based or whatever. They've done a census on the basis of it where everyone has had to tick a box. And then this is a version that they put out. And, you know, I've done episodes with Swapna Little, and Manu and I also discussed how the education system is such a big deal for them, where they're pushing these stories, pushing the narratives. But what they manage to do is they affect our view of ourselves. You know, earlier I quoted from Manu Devadevan where he talks about the people in Karnataka before a certain point. They may worship Shiva and they may worship Vishnu, but they're not defining themselves based on that. It is like, you know, I like wearing black, you like wearing white. It's not a definitional thing. I'm not part of a black wearing tribe, right? That's just the way it is. But you know, the British start doing the definitions, the ossification, and then that becomes a problem because when all of this oppression is happening, the question there is that how do you rise out of it? You have to tell a counter story. You are being told a story that you are a backward people. These guys are going to civilize you. The story also has elements where they try to divide you, especially after 1857, you know, the divide and rule comes into play. They want to divide Hindus and Muslims. Those elements get incorporated into the stories. So these are the stories. You want to counter the story. How do you counter these stories? What narratives do you build? Because you can no longer assimilate, right? These guys want to rule you. They don't want their god to be Vishnu's avatar or Shiva's brother or whatever. They want to rule you. So what do you do?
So, what was the response in the Indian society to all these developments?
So there are different responses coming up with different movements being formed, right? And Manu talks in particular about three of them, and I'll quickly kind of go over them before we come to modern politics and the rise of Hinduism in the 20th century, right? The first is Raja Ram Mohan Roy, or, you know, he's called Raja now. Ram Mohan Roy, good Bengali man who writes his first book called Tufat al-Muwawiddin, I think that's the name, in Persian, right, where he's got pretty radical views about religion and he wants to reform it and etc. etc. And then he starts writing in Bengali. And Ram Mohan Roy is an anglicized man. He eventually spends a few years in London. He's even the emissary of the Mughal emperor before Bahadur Shah Zafar, I think, to you know, to London itself. And he's comfortable hanging out with the British. And the frame through which he then goes into his writings is that, look, Hinduism is awesome. You know, there are parts of it which appear pre-modern. I want to redefine Hinduism to align it with my modern sensibilities, and I want the British to feel ki, haan, these guys are worthy of respect. So these are his imperatives. And for this, he looks to the later Vedas, to the Upanishads for his guidance, because then he can cite that and say that, hey, look, all of these things have much in common with your philosophy. This is not polytheistic stuff. It resembles your stuff very well. There is so much wisdom in it. And that is a whole sort of game that he is playing. And it's interesting that earlier when he writes his first book in Persian, which is language of the elites and all that, he's, in a sense, he's trying to figure the world out. It is a quest. But by the time he goes deeper into his writings and his engagements in Bengali and so on, he has really now become what a modern columnist would be, that he's trying to convince people of a point of view. And this is a sort of point of view. And of course, Ram Mohan Roy is the founder of the Brahmo Samaj, and the Brahmo Samaj comes from here. And this is a version that the British really like. It is decent. These people make for good babus. There are some great intellectuals there. You go all the way to Tagore with this. Swami Vivekananda is sort of in this vein, in this mold of person. In this vein of thinking, even if not a Brahmo Samaji. So this is a Brahmo Samaj. So this is one strain. Another strain comes from a very interesting man called Dayanand Saraswati. Dayanand Saraswati doesn't care about the British. He's on his own little journey. One of his foundational moments is when he's at a temple one particular night and there's been some prasad left for the idol, and a mouse comes and starts eating the prasad. And he says, oh my God, this is the idol of Shiva. The God will strike the mouse down dead. Nothing happens. The mouse eats the prasad and goes away. And he begins to question what he is seeing. And then he begins to travel. He spends a few years with a hermit. And he's a very curious man. At one point, I think on the banks of the Ganga, he comes across a corpse. And he cuts open the corpse because it has been described to him in the scriptures what bodies look like from the inside. And he wants to see if it is true. And he cuts it open and he finds that it is not true, but that's irrelevant. So he's on this questing journey. And through this questing journey, in which the British are not part of his scene at all, he arrives at a version of Hinduism for himself, which has a lot to do with the early Vedas, right? He not only doesn't care about the British, he is disgusted by this Puranic Hinduism that we described, which is a beautiful melange, a khichdi of everything. He is disgusted by it. He wants a purer vision where everything is clear, where your precepts, come from a particular place. So he forms the Arya Samaj, and he in fact spends some time at the Brahmo Samaj in Kolkata, where he learns from the people who are there that, dude, you can't speak in highfalutin language, you got to speak in the language of the people. So I think he starts writing in Hindi. He learns the art of publishing pamphlets from them, doing publicity, doing marketing, doing brand building, all that he kind of learns from them. But he's building a different kind of movement. So Ram Mohan Roy, a more genteel version of Hinduism, later Vedas. Dayanand Saraswati, ignoring all of the modifications, as he calls them, going back to the source, early Vedas, a much more militant version. And towards the end of the 19th century, when Dayanand Saraswati dies, there is an assumption, and it is an assumption among the elites who often tend to be wrong, that the Brahmo Samaj will survive and thrive and the Arya Samaj will fall away completely. And it's an interesting lesson of history that actually that doesn't happen. It is a Brahmo Samaj which becomes almost utterly irrelevant and something that only the elites indulge in. One of our very dear friends, Evanshu Datta, is in fact a Brahmo Samaji, and he's done an episode of The Seen and the Unseen with me where I think he talks about it for a bit. But these are really by now, not part of the mainstream at all. And it is, from the core of what the Arya Samaj stood for, emerges modern political Hinduism, right? And the third reformer that Manu speaks about in his chapter is the great Jyotirao Phule. Just an amazing thinker, not just an amazing thinker in terms of the question of caste, and I will come back to caste later, not just a great thinker in terms of the question of caste, but also of the role of women in Hindu society. Because it is almost normalized by now that, women stay at home and they do the cooking and they don't need to be educated, and that is their role. And none of the quote-unquote reformers of the past even question this. And Jyotirao Phule, whose wife is also so formidable, as together they question it and they fight for it. And that is a great movement worth studying in great depth. But for the purpose of this episode, they don't really play so much of a role in what goes on to happen.
So Amit, you've showed us a story from 2000 BC all the way into modern times.
300,000 BC, bruh.
300,000 BC.
Yeah.
And so now connect up these three strands into modern political Hinduism and the nature of the Indian state.
So it's a linear line. What's happening here is that these people, Ram Mohan Roy and Dayanand Saraswati, begin an individual quest. They are trying to define Hinduism for themselves. So both of them, it becomes something more, where they become proselytizers of a certain narrative of what Hinduism is about. Now, what is really happening here is that there is oppression. There are people who gradually realize that to fight this oppression, we need a nationalism. We need something that unites us. But what is the factor that can form the nationalism? Hey, why not try Hinduism? right? So you have this tussle within the Congress between the moderates and the extremists, as they are called. Our heroes, my heroes, at least, I'm sure they are heroes of yours as well, are really the moderates. People like, Rana Day, who I quoted earlier, or Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Agarkar, so on and so forth, who are men who follow liberal ends through conservative means. They don't want to burn everything down. And one of the people Gokhale is always fighting with is Bal Gangadhar Tilak, right? Now, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, when you look at him on the surface, is frankly a pretty odious man in many ways. He doesn't want girls to be educated. He doesn't want girls in school. Many of his views are backward. But as a political strategist, he is deeply astute. He realizes that if I want to build a political movement, we can't talk about it in elite drawing rooms. We have to go out there and, rouse the masses. How do we do this? And the first of the big things he does is he does two things. And one of them is that he revives the notion of Shivaji as a brand. Shivaji, in a sense, was, one of the earliest articulators of the Hindu identity, Hindu versus the other. In that frame, was one of the earliest articulators of a Hindu Rashtra, even if he didn't use those precise words. So he rouses Shivaji as part of his modern sort of pantheon of heroes, and there's a festival. The second truly important thing that he does is he revives Ganapati as a celebration. His idea is that we need people that which will give us a sense of unity, which will bring people out on the streets together to celebrate. And he's thinking of Maharashtra at this time. And he's saying, take the local thing of festival of Ganapati, which is not really celebrated at any scale at that point, and make it a grand celebration. So hundreds of thousands of people are out on the streets, and once you've mobilized them and given them that common identity, you can use it for other purposes. But what Tilak hasn't yet done is that he's not exactly defined what is Hinduism, right? You can talk about the other as being either Muslims, or the British, and the current fight of Tilak is really against the British. But what is your raison d'etre? How do you build that sense of identity? And the man who really does this is Vinayak Savarkar, right? Now, I've discussed Savarkar at detail in my episode with Manu. You should listen to that. When I read the biographies of Savarkar, and I've read pretty much all of them, the one thing that you realize is that there are two Savarkars. There is a Savarkar till 1910, and there is a Savarkar that comes later. Until 1910, Savarkar is a Bhagat Singh kind of figure. Like if he died in 1910, we would think of him as we do of Bhagat Singh, right? He was organizing revolutionary acts. His book was praised by Nehru. He appeared on a stage in London with Gandhi. Gandhi liked him a lot by all means. And all his utterances until that time are utterances about Muslims and Hindus have to fight together. We have to shrug off the yoke together. 1910, he is imprisoned. He is imprisoned in the Andamans, and he is not a political prisoner. He is treated as a terrorist, and therefore the kind of imprisonment he gets is very different from the genteel imprisonment Nehru Gandhi got, where and after I read about this, I read diaries from the Andamans of other prisoners there, and it was pretty horrible. And what really happens there is the British are the jailers, but they have a class in between them and the jailed, and these are Muslim men, mostly Pathans, who are absolutely brutal in their treatment of the prisoners. They tortured them. There are rumors that what was done to Savarkar was worse than torture. I leave it to your imagination to figure out what it is. But the deal is that he's completely radicalized by these years. He comes out, at the end of that decade, close to 1920, and he's completely radicalized, and he just hates Muslims with a zeal. And then he writes this book called The Elements of Hindutva, right, which is where the term was coined before that, but that is, in a sense, one of the points at the birth of modern Hindutva. And the first time I read that book, I thought, what a lousy book. The argument is incoherent. The argumentation is terrible. Plus, I really, really disagree with this guy. Right? But the more you look at it, what Manu points out and what I have come to realize is that there is something in the way that he frames what Hindutva is, which is a political masterstroke. Right? I did an episode with Shruti Kapila once where she spoke about how Hindutva is a theory of violence in search of an history. Savarkar gives it the history. His reasoning is this: what is a Hindu, right? First of all, he is defining Hindutva as an umbrella term. Hinduism is one part of it, right? It is not that Hindutva is a subset of Hinduism. Hinduism is a subset of Hindutva. And what does this umbrella term means? He comes up with the brilliant definition that anyone is part of Hindutva if two conditions are met. These conditions are necessary but not sufficient on their own. You need both of them. One is that this land, India as it were, this land has to be your homeland. The second is this has to be your holy land. So you have to be from here, and this is where you have to worship. Now you see what this does. This others the British, obviously. It even others the Muslims because they're turning to Mecca to pray, right? But it brings everyone else into the fold. The Buddhists, the Jains, the Shaivites, the Vaishnavites, the Dalits. In his formulation, they are all now part of this. So now obviously the question to ask, which you and I would ask, is why? Why this formulation? Nobody asked that. It's a politically powerful formulation. It takes a hold in the imagination, and it gives a reason for you to then build this movement outwards, and that's why it succeeds. I did a great episode with Akshay Mukul, who's written this masterpiece on the Gita Press, which kind of takes you through what was happening in the culture, what was happening in society through all of these decades. And Hinduism had a really strong hold on the imagination. It was a core part of people's identity. And when you combine it with this particular political movement which plays on this particular strand and this particular kind of othering, because note that this is, in a sense, it's a radical departure. All this time, this great open source religion has been taking in the multitudes. In that sense, tolerance is really part of the DNA. Not just tolerance, acceptance, embrace. Everything goes into that beautiful melting pot and it works. But this is hardcore othering. This is saying to the British that you don't belong here, which is great. This is saying to Muslims that you don't belong here, right? And that is, in a sense, the foundation of the movement, which, one strand of the politics that we see today.
So, Amit, put all this together. How will you take stock of this journey? How should we understand the great land around us?
So I want to, take stock of this journey by talking about caste. That's a question you cannot get away from. I often call it the original sin of Hinduism, though now it seems clear it's not an original sin per se, but it is a deep problem, within certain strands of Hinduism, and you cannot wish it away. And the question is, it is simply a social evil, much like sati, is got to go, right? Why do we think like this? Why are we like this? Why is this part of our cultural DNA is an important question. Now, the thing to note here is that how does religion change? How does society change? We both want this to change. How does it really change? It changes from the bottom up, or it can change from the top down, right? I'm skeptical of the top down view. For example, if you look at political Hinduism today, if you look at Hindutva, actually Savarkar's whole thing was that, boss, I want to, Dalits are part of my creed. He in fact pissed off Brahmins. He would go to, I think, Ratnagiri it was, where he would organize feasts where all the castes would eat together. And the Brahmins were pissed off at him, and he did it repeatedly. It's not one act of virtue signaling, right? And his part of his reason was, I, really want this movement to succeed, and therefore, it's an imperative that Dalits have to be part of this movement. The RSS will kind of sing the same tune. Modern Hinduism sings the same tune. Modern Hindutva rather sings the same tune, where the achievement of the BJP, in a sense, in 2014 was to unite the Hindu vote, right? Which was, you thought it couldn't be done, but they managed to do it. But the point is, did they really do it? What they really did was that they went into those fissures and they exploited aspects of those fissures, like all parties have done throughout our history. So they would, for example, go to UP and they would say, okay, the Jatavs are voting for Mayawati, but we will appeal to the non-Jatav Dalits, who are pissed off because Jatavs are relatively better off in the Dalit hierarchy. They would come to Maharashtra and say that, okay, the OBC vote has gone, but has the OBC vote gone? The Maratha vote has gone. But there are non-Maratha OBCs, and we can appeal to their resentments. So in a sense, they played the same kind of game. The other way of looking at caste is, if you don't do a political wiping away of it, consolidate them, etc., etc. If that doesn't work, and I believe it can't really work, if that doesn't work, you can do it through legislation and so on. I'm skeptical of all top-down measures. What I am deeply hopeful about is, just as Hinduism was shaped from the bottom up, its ills can also gradually be cleaned up from the bottom up. I spoke about how the formation of Hinduism was, in a sense, religious curation by spontaneous order. Another great illustration of spontaneous order is markets and the way they work. I look at what happened, for example, after 1991. we keep speaking about how hundreds of millions of people came out of poverty. That includes hundreds of millions of Dalits. That includes, that includes an empowerment of people who otherwise would have been oppressed and trod upon, and that actually happened. And which is why, when Chandrabhan Prasad, and he's a great Dalit scholar who did an episode of The Seen and the Unseen with me, when he said, my heroes are Ambedkar and Adam Smith, that is utterly resonant with me, right? Ambedkar lets you know how deep the problems are and how they cannot be solved within the current system, but Adam Smith gives you the way out. Now, there is no magic bullet. Social ills can take decades to change, as that famous saying goes, paradigms change one funeral at a time. You don't change the minds of people, you don't wipe away the prejudices of people. That they die and then you get a new generation. That is unfortunately the way the world works. So nothing's going to happen overnight, but if you get economic growth, when you go, there's always less casteism in the cities. Don't misinterpret me, I'm not saying there's none, but there's less casteism in cities than in villages and so on. And it is because your incentives change in larger economic networks, and those incentives drive you. A rupee is a rupee, whether a Dalit is paying you or a Brahmin is paying you. Labor is labor, whoever it is coming from. People who discriminate actually suffer in a free market. So that is what kind of gives me hope about this. I would not say don't do any of the top down stuff, do all of that, but I have some hope that over a period of time this will hopefully help.
And a last great force reshaping this landscape is secularization. So, what we see all over the world is that when people are very poor, they are not oriented towards religion. And when you come out to the top of being a successful economy and having well educated people who read books and are plugged into the world, then secularization comes. So, I think India got that peak middle because of the 91 reforms, where there was a middle class that woke up and tried to talk about their own identity. But in time, secularization will come for India as well.
So finally, as we end the episode, I actually want to talk about politics, right? Hindutva is a force today. Political Hinduism is very much active. What does it mean for all of us, right? And I think that Hinduism per se is perfectly compatible with whatever kind of life we want to live, right? I happen to be a non-believer, but if I was a believer, I would find in the religion, precepts and values that are perfectly compatible with the kind of classical liberal way of living that you and I believe in, where women are respected, where there are no divisions in society, where consent matters. You can find all of those. It is still in some ways a khichdi. Manu described it in his book as an ever-expanding tapestry, but the outer borders got defined by colonialism and then these movements coming up. And I feel that no, it is still a tapestry where there's a lot happening within. It's a beautiful melting pot. Practicing Hindus will still go to dargahs. They will still have biryani on Eid. In the abstract, we might hate the other, but in the concrete, we are always sort of intermingling. And I think that is awesome. And the key is that to be a good Hindu is perhaps to just, embrace all of the world as it is and look at it with love.
But this is sort of where you started on the three strands, that the Hinduism of Ram Mohan Roy and Tagore and Gandhiji and Nehru was a very optimistic vision that you can come back to humanism in India and connect up with the world and find your own peace with the West. And that was the sort of project that they were building. And for some time, I know in my parents' generation, it was thought that that's in the bag, that, in India, there is no great crisis. We are not in a conflict between the medieval and the modern, and we are incrementally evolving out of that. But today, the events of the last 20 years have showed us a very different face of the country. And so today we are far more in the open questions that, is there a crisis about how India will engage with the world?
And I just feel that the Raja Ram Mohan Roy vision, the vision of the elites, all the people you named, it was bound to fail. They were deracinated elites. They were as influenced by the West as by India. And in certain ways, some of them, not all of them, were a little condescending of the unwashed masses. I don't think that approach works. I think true reform will only happen from the bottom up. Maybe Dayanand Saraswati and the Arya Samaj and Tilak and so on took it in a direction that we may not like, but there are other directions possible. And one of the great lessons of the modern world is that cooperation works much more than competition. Those imperatives of those times have changed. The British have gone. They are not oppressors we need to throw off. There are local oppressors in terms of coercion and various forces. But by and large, the great lesson of the modern world is that ahimsa, as defined by the Harappans perhaps, trading, not raiding, mutual benefit, cooperation, that's a way forward. And that is compatible with Hinduism for those who, want to kind of bring them together. To me, the labels don't matter. I live by the values I do, but I don't think the values I do are necessarily foreign values. I think they are also there in the air around us.
Okay, Amit, for gentle readers who have loved your story so far, tell them what they should be reading.
So everything that they should be reading, and that the first things that I want to recommend are books I've already mentioned, episodes I've already mentioned, Manu's book, Tony Joseph's book, Devdutt Patnaik's books, Arshia Sattar's book, and all of them tackle different aspects of it, and all of those people may not even agree with the stuff that I've said here, but they're all interesting books, and I'll add some more interesting books in the show notes to kind of get into this. But what I would urge other people like me, especially English-speaking elites in urban India who have never really engaged with Hinduism, etc., is that don't be condescending towards it. This is not infra-dig stuff. I said to Manu on our episode that I used to think there are as many Hinduisms as there are Hindus. I actually think there are more Hinduisms than there are Hindus, because even people who may not use that label still have aspects of that running through their cultural veins, as it were. So, in a way, if you want to understand yourself, you have to understand your society. If you want to understand your society, you have to understand the deep past. So, just keep an open mind. Remember, all of the things that you're reading are description, not prescription. They are explanation and not exculpation. You should still be guided by the values that you have, as we are, but be open to the world and to the lessons of history.